Are you a fan of action RPGs and lots of loot? Can you not wait the literal 85 years it will take before Diablo 4 actually releases? Yes to both of those questions, you say. Great, I've got a game for you. How's it going, everybody? My name is just Jared, but you can just call me Jared, no matter what my channel name still says. Today's loot-filled game is a recently released into early access title called The Slormancer. I know it's a weird title, just go with it. I know you're just now seeing the gameplay, and yes, it has pixel graphics, but please don't leave, you'll regret it. This game is epic. I know some people just can't seem to play games that don't look super realistic and require like GTX 80 gazillion graphics cards or whatever, so fair warning if that's you, this game does indeed have pixel graphics, obviously, because you can see the game now. Why am I pointing this out, Jared? Stick to the script. After 30 hours in, I can safely say that any fans of this genre will have a pretty good time with this, even with it being a tad limited right now due to early access, but at the $15 price tag, it's well worth it. First off, since the main focus here on this channel is loot, we're going to cruise right on through the basics of what the Slormancer is, just so you get the gist and you're not terribly lost. Then we'll dive into everything about the loot. The Slormancer is a single-player, top-down action RPG, pixel graphics, we know this. Basically, you're the last hope of humanity because you poison the town's original hero on accident in the first 5 seconds of the game, you monster. And your goal is to hunt down and kill the Slormancer, who is an evil sorcerer. In the full game, you'll journey through tons of locations and dungeons, etc., on your quest to find and defeat the Slormancer. There's 3 classes. You've got the Knight, the Mage, and the Huntress. I'm sure you can guess which each one specializes in. There's tons of skills that all have their own skill trees. There's ability points, unique items, crafting, procedural areas, a comedic story, lots of loot, and I mean there's like lots of loot. I wouldn't say Borderlands level of loot, but more like Diablo 3 amount of loot, but harder to obtain and not thrown at you like food is during a food fight. I sat here for 10 minutes trying to think of a better analogy than food at a food fight, but that's where you're going to get because I'm all out of other ideas. Alright, loot time. Big props to the developers here, because you have almost unlimited freedom in this game with how you want to play, in terms of loot, skills, abilities, respecking, playstyles, builds, literally everything. There are a whopping 12 slots for gear, 11 for armor, 1 for your weapon. You've got a slot for helmet, amulet, 2 rings, chest cape, belt, glove, boots, shoulders, and bracers spread across the 5 rarities, including legendary. Did I say that fast enough for you? There's technically only 3 weapon classes in the game, each being exclusive to the classes. Huntresses can only use bows, knights can only use swords, and mages can only use staffs or whatever. I actually haven't played as the mage yet, but I'm sure it's some kind of magical stick or something. Why this weapon limitation isn't bad like it would be in most loot-based games is because there are 120 of these weapons for each class, and each one is unique. Each of these weapons are called Slorm Reapers, and each have their own effects and properties, and some of them are build-defining weapons. Using a Slorm Reaper levels it up over time, increasing its damage and effects, and each Slorm Reaper will evolve at a certain level, giving it a cool visual overhaul and more properties. These weapons also have pretty low drop rates, which is great in my opinion for game longevity. I found 16, I think, after 30 hours of playtime to give you an idea, but if you want to, you can increase the drop rate of these via the gear you equip. You can literally make a build solely for collecting all the weapons if you want to. Moving on from that, if you're used to playing these types of games, you already know what to expect when it comes to affixes, etc. on loot. I'd say this game has a lot more depth than Diablo 3, but it's definitely not as chaotic as something like Path of Exile. You're not going to feel like you need to set aside 6 months of free time and pay for night classes to learn what is even happening in this game. Did I just throw shade at Path of Exile? I'll never tell. The Slormancer is not too overly complicated, but you can't play it blindfolded like you can Diablo 3, you get what I'm saying, more shade thrown. The most complicated part is the crafting, which we'll get to a little later. Everything else is just choices. You have a ton of choices. They're not necessarily complicated. You just have a frickin' ton of choices. One super important thing I should mention before we get too much further in this video is that loot doesn't change how your character looks in this game. I know that's a deal breaker for many. It usually is for me. I'm a stickler for visual progression. I'd argue it's just as important as loot progression, but for some reason I'm fine with it not being here. I really think it's just the freedom of loot and the amount of it, coupled with like the evolving weapons mechanic that's really cool, that kind of makes me ignore the lack of visual progression. Maybe on full release it would be cool to unlock or craft skins so we have some various cosmetic personalization, but for now it really doesn't bother me at all. 30 hours of playtime, and I haven't even found the second highest rarity of gear. Whoa, let future Jared cut in right here. Look at this, I finally found one. I just had to complain about it. Look at me freaking out in-game, IRL, I had tears in my eyes, I was so happy. Now I have to change the script and re-record. Fun. 30 hours of playtime, and I haven't found a single legendary yet, which is the highest rarity. Under any circumstance, I'm fine with this. I enjoy loot games that make their pinnacle gear actually hard to get or actually rare. I'm looking at you with a disappointed stare, Destiny. Although I will say, because this game is in early access and there's currently only one active story and 2 locations to hack and slash through, it does begin to get a bit boring after hours of seeing the same enemy in the same location, dropping the same loot with minimal differences or increases and decreases in stats. Epic rarity gear, like the one you just saw me finally get, has a lot more oomph to them, which gets me pumped to find more, but if it's going to take me another 20 of the same dungeon run to get one more, this point remains valid. That once you get to a point where you have an idea of a build or one that you're trying to improve, you start to look for gear with specific stats, so mostly everything you just end up selling, and with the slow loot rarity progression, you're only getting very minimal improvements to that build you're working on. Seeing the same environments, etc., makes the experience feel very samey once you started working towards a build. Once more of the game is out, I'd imagine this issue will be less apparent because the game itself will actually have more variation and things to do, whereas right now you're limited to one endgame activity set in one of 2 possible locations. That is essentially just an endless dungeon with tiered difficulty settings that improve the quality of rewards. Let's talk crafting and forging. The devs here basically said, hey, whatever you want to do to your loot, do it. You can take a level 1 common helmet and enhance it all the way up to an epic endgame helmet with a ton of stats if you want, if you have the materials, and if you have the time. You can change individual properties to completely new ones, or just change the percentage of a property you already have. You can add properties, remove properties, upgrade rarities, reinforce gear to upgrade everything about it, imbue items with character attribute bonuses, amongst a plethora of other things. Did you get all that? With all these options comes lots of crafting materials. Maybe a bit too many crafting materials. I think it would be a lot less confusing and convoluted if the different materials for crafting weren't all different variations of the same exact word. Slorm, S-L-O-R-M, is already what you collect from killing enemies. But now you have Slormline fragments, Slormline chunks, Slormites, Slormandroids, Wonkadoos, Flimflams, and Bonzonaros. 3 of those are fake, but I have to hit my dumb joke quota for this video, so there's another. All of these Slorm materials have multiple versions spread across all the rarities and are all used to do specific things to your gear. Combining materials to create higher tiered versions is possible too. Are you ready for an example? I don't think you are. I know I'm not. Here we go. Incomplete inferior Slormites are made from combining Slormline fragments. 3 inferior Slormites make an inferior Slormite chunk. 3 inferior Slormite chunks make an inferior flawless. 3 inferior flawless make an incomplete modest. 3 incomplete modest make a modest. 3 modest make a modest flawless. 3 modest flawless make an incomplete greater. 3 incomplete greater make a greater. 3 graters make a greater flawless. 3 greater flawless make an incomplete superior. Jesus Christ. And this is only one type of crafting material. Jokes aside, it's okay. It's just more of a why is this so convoluted kind of thing. 100% complete honesty. Every time I get back to town from a dungeon run, I end up running around trying to remember what the hell each crafting material actually does, to the point where I usually just ignore them until I get a ton of them saved up for when I actually feel like they're worth the trouble. I might also just be too used to other action RPGs where you don't usually start tinkering with your gear until you have accumulated epic or legendary stuff, but either way, it's not a huge problem. I'm sure crafting in its entirety will evolve as early access continues on. As far as skills and abilities go, if you love making your own builds and stuff, you'll be in heaven here. You've got like hundreds of skill choices and modifiers, specializations, and passives for each class, some of which are limited right now due to early access. You got the classic character attribute system as well as the weapon evolution mechanic I talked about a second ago, and you have full freedom to respec everything basically for free, so you can tinker around to your heart's content all day, every day if you want. My first build was more defensive and tankier, but I ended up not being able to deal out enough damage, and my current work in progress build is a tad more chaotic if you can't tell from the gameplay in the background. My stuff is nothing compared to what I see in the community, but I enjoy trying to make my own build work, and if you're the same, you'll be right at home with the Slormancer. Closing thoughts. Diablo 4 isn't coming out for another 22 decades, so buy this game. Also, the Slormancer is very funny. Here's a recent discovery I made. It's the Sword of the Goldfish. It's a sword, but also a fish. It grants a skill called Splish Splash, which does nothing much. It literally says it does nothing much, but it lasts for 15 seconds. Or one of the grappling hook skill modifiers that reads, when grappling hook hits an enemy, you pull him back to you, put your arm over his shoulder, and proceed to convince him to fight for the cause and everything that is good and green in this world. He accepts. I like the jokes. The jokes are good. I give the early access version of the Slormancer a loot review of 8 very hard to get epic items out of 10. This score would be higher if epic items started dropping like, 5 character levels sooner. If they're even tied to character level, I don't even know if they are. Or if they were a bit more common a little bit earlier on in the game, there would be a lot more early motivation to keep playing and grinding for better gear. I'm worried some players might stop because the time gap between obtaining blue gear and yellow gear is quite a large time gap. Reducing that could help with loot progression and motivation. There's an idea for the dev who's definitely not watching this. And that's it for this video, guys. If you thought this video was dope or funny or informational, leave a like because it makes me feel pretty good. These take a long time to make and it helps with the algorithm or whatever, something like that. Subscribe for more stuff like this. I cover games that focus on loot and nothing but loot, so if that tickles your fancy, then this is the place for you. Links to socials are down below, as well as the link to the Slormancer on Steam. Unlimited kisses through a pane of glass because COVID to all my Patreon supporters whose names are bouncing around on screen right now. If you also want unlimited kisses through a pane of glass because COVID and your name bouncing around on screen at the end of my videos, then consider supporting me on Patreon because I like money. I should probably leave that last part out. Nah, we'll just leave it in. It's a good bit. Laters, everyone.